You won't believe what just happened in the Supreme Court, and the shocking truth is that almost no one is talking about it. 5 major gun laws have been quietly changed, and if you thought your understanding of firearm ownership was complete, think again. On top of that, 12 states could ban gun registration entirely in 2026, creating a legal landscape that could leave millions of Americans scrambling to adjust. This isn't speculation. It's happening right now, and if you don't know the details, you could face unexpected consequences. Today, we're going to dive deep into exactly what has changed, why it matters, and what every gun owner needs to do to protect themselves in the coming months. Let's start with the Supreme Court decision itself. The court issued rulings that might look minor at first glance, but in reality, they completely alter how gun laws are interpreted across the country. We're talking about changes to background checks, reporting requirements, definitions of restricted firearms, self-defense laws, and interstate sales regulations. Each of these adjustments has layers of impact, and together, they form a legal shift that could affect your rights, your responsibilities, and the way law enforcement interacts with gun owners. If you live in a state considering a registration ban, the timing of these rulings couldn't be more critical. The first change concerns the way certain firearms are defined and classified. The Supreme Court clarified what counts as a restricted firearm, which might sound technical, but it has massive real-world consequences. In practice, this could mean that guns previously considered legal under state law may now fall under stricter regulations, or vice versa. For everyday gun owners, this reclassification can affect what types of firearms you are legally allowed to own, sell, or transfer. It also affects dealers, who now have to carefully consider whether their inventory falls within these newly clarified categories. The confusion is compounded because not all states interpret these definitions the same way, meaning compliance in one state doesn't guarantee compliance in another. Next, the court addressed background checks. The new rulings adjust when and how they must be performed. In some cases, the process has been streamlined, reducing bureaucracy for buyers. But in other ways, the changes create loopholes that could be exploited, and that's where many gun owners could unintentionally get into trouble. For instance, private sales or transfers might no longer require the same level of documentation in some states, but federal authorities could still enforce stricter standards, leaving you caught between conflicting rules. Understanding the nuances of these new background check requirements is not optional. It's critical for staying on the right side of the law. Reporting requirements for gun sales and transfers have also been altered. Certain states may no longer have the legal authority to enforce detailed reporting, which has far-reaching consequences. While some might see this as a freedom-enhancing change, it could also make it harder to track firearms in criminal cases. For law enforcement, this creates a significant challenge in ensuring public safety. For private citizens, it introduces risk because the lack of consistent record-keeping could leave you vulnerable if your firearm is lost, stolen, or misused by someone else. The Supreme Court also addressed self-defense laws. The ruling includes subtle but important changes to how courts interpret the use of firearms in emergencies. This could affect cases where a gun owner claims self-defense, with judges and juries evaluating the circumstances under a slightly different standard than before. While this may seem abstract, the practical effect is profound. It could redefine the legal boundaries of using a firearm to protect yourself, your family, or your property. Many gun owners might not realize these implications until they find themselves in a high-stakes situation where interpretation of the law could make all the difference. Interstate sales have also been impacted. The new ruling clarifies certain restrictions on selling firearms across state lines, which affects both private sellers and licensed dealers. What was previously a relatively straightforward process now requires careful legal consideration. Failing to follow these new guidelines could result in fines, penalties, or even criminal charges. This is particularly concerning for people who buy guns in one state and transport them to another for personal use. With 12 states potentially banning registration, Navigating this patchwork system will be more complicated than ever. Speaking of those 12 states, this is where the story gets even more intense. States that are moving toward banning gun registration entirely in 2026 are effectively eliminating the legal record of firearm ownership. On one hand, proponents argue that this restores privacy and reduces bureaucratic red tape for law-abiding citizens. On the other hand, opponents warn that it creates serious gaps in public safety, making it harder to track stolen guns or prevent illegal sales. For gun owners, this presents a critical choice. Understand your state's legislation now and prepare accordingly, or risk being caught in legal limbo when these bans take effect. The interaction between the Supreme Court rulings and state-level laws cannot be overstated. Many gun owners assume that if they follow state law, they are safe. That assumption is now risky. The federal rulings override some state regulations, but not all. Some states may continue to enforce older laws until new legislation is passed, while others may move quickly to implement changes. This inconsistency could lead to confusion, disputes, and legal challenges. Essentially, what is legal in one state might be illegal just a few miles away, and federal law may not provide the clarity you need. Public reaction to these rulings has been mixed, to say the least. Gun rights organizations are celebrating, calling this a historic win for personal freedoms and constitutional rights. Meanwhile, safety advocates and some law enforcement officials are sounding alarms, warning that the combination of federal changes and state registration bans could lead to more untracked firearms and increased risks in communities. Both perspectives are valid, and understanding them is crucial. For gun owners, this means staying informed is no longer optional. You need to know the law, know your rights, and know your responsibilities. Ignorance could cost you, and in this environment, even small mistakes can have serious consequences. Let's consider some practical scenarios to illustrate the real-world impact. Imagine a gun owner in one of the 12 states planning to ban registration. Today, that person complies fully with state law. Tomorrow, new legislation eliminates the requirement for registration, and suddenly, their firearm is part of a system that no longer tracks ownership. If that gun is lost or stolen, law enforcement may not be able to recover it or identify the owner. For those who travel across state lines, the consequences could be even more complicated. A firearm perfectly legal in one state could be considered unregistered and illegal in another. Planning ahead and understanding these nuances is essential for avoiding trouble. Another scenario involves private sales. Many gun owners buy, sell, or transfer firearms without going through dealers. Previously, state law often required documentation and registration. Now, the Supreme Court's changes could reduce some of these requirements in certain states, but federal law may still impose rules. This creates a gray area where even honest citizens could inadvertently break the law. Consulting legal experts and keeping meticulous records is no longer just a recommendation, it's a necessity. The political implications of these rulings are also huge. For years, there has been tension between states that prioritize gun rights and those that focus on gun control. The Supreme Court's intervention shifts the balance, giving states a stronger legal basis to pursue deregulation if they choose. At the same time, states with stricter gun control laws may have to adjust their policies or face legal challenges. This is a pivotal moment in American gun law, and the next few years will determine how balanced the system is between personal freedom and public safety. Traveling across state lines will also become a complex challenge for gun owners. Imagine driving from a state that requires strict registration to one that eliminates it entirely. Without careful planning, you could unintentionally violate the law simply by carrying your own firearm legally purchased and owned. The Supreme Court ruling adds another layer of complexity because federal authorities may interpret laws differently than state governments. Staying informed, carrying documentation, and understanding both state and federal regulations will be critical. Media coverage of these developments has been minimal, which makes this story even more important. Most headlines focus on a single aspect, like the number of states considering registration bans or one of the 5 law changes. Few explain how these rulings interact, what they mean for individual gun owners, or how to navigate this evolving legal landscape. That's why watching this video, understanding these changes, and acting now is essential. The consequences of ignorance could be far-reaching and permanent. Now, let's talk about what you should do immediately to protect yourself. First, review your state laws carefully. Understand which of the 5 Supreme Court changes apply to you, and consider how upcoming registration bans might affect your firearms. Second, keep all records up to date and easily accessible. Even if your state moves toward deregulation, federal authorities or other states might still require proof of legal ownership. Third, consider consulting a legal expert. Even a brief consultation can save you from expensive fines, lost property, or criminal charges in the future. Being proactive is no longer optional. It's essential. The timing of these rulings couldn't be more urgent. With 2026 approaching and 12 states actively moving toward registration bans, the legal landscape will change rapidly. Gun owners who wait until the last minute may find themselves unprepared, confused, and potentially in violation of new laws without even realizing it. This is not hypothetical. It's happening now. Every day you delay researching, consulting experts, and updating records increases your risk. The Supreme Court's changes also have implications for law enforcement. Agencies will need to adjust procedures, reinterpret reporting requirements, and develop strategies to handle unregistered firearms if state bans take effect. This could lead to temporary confusion, uneven enforcement, and delays in investigations. For citizens, this uncertainty is another reason to take personal responsibility seriously. You cannot rely solely on the system to protect you or to clarify what is legal. Knowledge, preparation, and vigilance are your best tools. Let's consider another critical element: self-defense situations. The ruling slightly alters how courts might interpret defensive gun use. While this may seem subtle, the practical effect could be huge. If you find yourself in a life-threatening situation, how authorities interpret your actions could determine whether you are protected or prosecuted. Understanding the nuances of these legal adjustments is essential to staying safe and lawful. Even experienced gun owners may not fully grasp the implications until they face a real scenario. It's also important to understand the social implications. Communities that have historically relied on state registration systems for tracking firearms could see increased risk if registration is eliminated. Advocates for deregulation argue that law-abiding citizens shouldn't be penalized, but critics worry about the consequences for public safety, especially in urban areas with higher rates of gun-related crime. As these changes unfold, both perspectives will influence policy debates, enforcement priorities, and how citizens interact with the law. Staying informed allows you to navigate these discussions intelligently. The combination of federal rulings and state-level changes could also affect gun culture in unexpected ways. Ownership, transfer, and transportation of firearms could become more legally complex, requiring more education and attention to detail. Dealers, collectors, and casual gun owners alike will need to adapt to these new realities. Whether you're purchasing for personal protection, hunting, or sport shooting, understanding both the legal and practical implications is essential to avoid unnecessary risks. Finally, it all comes down to preparation and awareness. These changes are happening quietly, and if you're not paying attention, you could find yourself on the wrong side of the law without realizing it. Understanding the 5 Supreme Court changes, the potential impact of registration bans in 12 states, and the practical steps you can take to protect yourself is critical. Staying informed, consulting legal experts, and keeping meticulous records are no longer optional. They're essential survival skills for gun owners in 2026 and beyond. In conclusion, the Supreme Court has issued a shockwave through American gun law. 5 major laws have been changed, 12 states are potentially banning registration, and the implications are massive for anyone who owns, sells, or transports firearms. This is not hypothetical. This is not theoretical. This is happening right now. Staying informed, understanding the practical and legal ramifications, and preparing for the changes ahead is essential for your safety, freedom, and peace of mind. Don't wait for enforcement to catch you by surprise. Act now, educate yourself, and protect your rights. What almost no one realizes today could become your biggest challenge tomorrow. So take these warnings seriously. The time to act is now, and the choices you make in the coming months could determine how well you navigate this new legal landscape. As the dust settles from the Supreme Court's recent decisions, it's becoming clearer that we are entering uncharted territory in American gun law. What was once relatively straightforward is now a complex maze of federal and state regulations, with serious consequences for anyone who fails to understand the new rules. For gun owners, this is a moment to pause, reflect, and act. Compliance is no longer just about filling out forms or following the same routines you've trusted for years. Every step, every purchase, and every transfer must now be carefully considered against the backdrop of these 5 major changes and the looming possibility of registration bans in 12 states. One of the first questions on everyone's mind is, what does this mean for personal safety? On the surface, deregulation and reduced registration requirements might feel liberating. For some, this seems like a step toward reclaiming individual rights. But freedom without preparation can quickly turn into risk. With fewer legal safeguards in place, the responsibility to ensure that firearms are handled safely, stored correctly, and used legally falls squarely on the individual. There is no longer a buffer of administrative oversight that automatically tracks ownership, which means that lost or stolen firearms can disappear into a system that may not have the tools to trace them effectively. The potential ban on registration in 12 states is perhaps the most dramatic change. For decades, state registration has been a core part of firearm regulation, allowing authorities to maintain records, investigate crimes, and prevent illegal transfers. Eliminating this system fundamentally changes how law enforcement interacts with gun owners. It also affects ordinary citizens in ways that are easy to underestimate. Imagine purchasing a firearm legally, only to find that in another state, your ownership is no longer recognized because registration no longer exists. Crossing state lines could become a high-stakes gamble, with federal law offering only partial protection and state interpretations varying widely. For anyone who travels frequently with firearms, whether for hunting, competitions, or relocation, this is an urgent concern. Let's dig deeper into the practical implications for dealers. Licensed firearm dealers have historically operated under a clear set of rules that included meticulous documentation, registration, and background checks. The Supreme Court's changes, coupled with potential state registration bans, now force them into a gray area of compliance. Even dealers who are committed to doing everything by the book could face legal challenges if state laws suddenly change or are interpreted differently from federal guidelines. This could result in fines, loss of licenses, or even criminal charges in extreme cases. The message is clear. Staying current with both federal and state regulations is no longer optional. It is essential for legal survival. The self-defense aspect of the Supreme Court ruling deserves particular attention. Courts now have slightly altered standards for evaluating cases of defensive gun use. While the changes might seem subtle to the casual observer, their practical impact is profound. For example, an individual defending their home or family may face different legal interpretations depending on whether they are in a state with a registration ban or a state that retains strict rules. In a worst-case scenario, failing to understand these nuances could turn a justified act of self-defense into a complex legal battle. Educating yourself on the new standards is no longer theoretical. It is essential preparation for real-world scenarios. The media coverage, or lack thereof, is another critical factor in this story. Most outlets are only reporting fragments. A single law change here, a potential state ban there. They fail to explain how these changes interact, how they impact everyday gun owners, and what concrete steps people need to take. This creates a dangerous gap between the law as written and public understanding. When laws change in ways that are not widely reported, ignorance becomes a real risk. For responsible gun owners, this is a call to action. Do not rely on headlines alone. Dive into the details, seek expert guidance, and maintain meticulous records. For those who think these changes don't apply to them, consider the case of a recreational hunter or a competitive shooter. A firearm that is legal in one state today could suddenly become unregistered and technically illegal in another if you travel across state lines. Competitions, hunting trips, and firearms training could all become risky ventures if you are unaware of the shifting legal landscape. This is why preparation is no longer optional. Understanding both the Supreme Court rulings and your state's response is crucial to avoid inadvertently breaking the law. The ripple effect extends to families as well. Parents who store firearms for self-defense or recreational purposes must now be doubly vigilant. With registration potentially eliminated in some states, ensuring that firearms are secure and legally accounted for becomes a personal responsibility rather than a state-administered safety measure. Failure to properly store or track firearms could lead to tragic consequences or legal liabilities. For families, this is about more than compliance. It's about safety, foresight, and protecting loved ones. Another area to consider is the potential rise of private transfers. With state registration banned in 12 states, individuals may increasingly rely on private sales or transfers that are no longer officially tracked. On one hand, this may feel empowering to gun owners who prefer privacy. On the other hand, it creates significant risk. If a firearm changes hands and is used in a crime, tracing it back to the original owner becomes nearly impossible. This is not just a theoretical concern. Law enforcement agencies have repeatedly warned that untracked firearms are far more likely to be involved in illegal activity. Responsible owners must think carefully about how they transfer firearms and maintain records, even if the law does not require it. Political implications cannot be ignored either. The Supreme Court's ruling shifts the balance of power between federal authority and states' rights. States that have traditionally been more restrictive now have legal arguments to reduce oversight, while those that favor strong regulation may face legal challenges if they attempt to enforce rules that conflict with federal interpretations. This tension could lead to legal battles, injunctions, and even conflicting rulings in different jurisdictions. For gun owners, this means that what is safe and legal today might be subject to reinterpretation tomorrow. Vigilance, legal awareness, and proactive action are now part of responsible gun ownership. Traveling with firearms is becoming more complicated than ever. For example, someone moving from a state that retains registration to one of the 12 states planning bans may inadvertently enter legal gray areas. Even if their firearm is legal, the lack of official records could cause complications if questioned by law enforcement. Airlines, transportation authorities, and state police may interpret the rules differently, creating additional risk. Planning routes, carrying documentation, and understanding both federal and state requirements is now critical. Ignorance is no longer a safe option. It could have serious consequences. The Supreme Court changes also have economic implications for the firearms industry. Dealers, manufacturers, and retailers must adjust to new rules around sales, transfers, and reporting. Inventory management, legal compliance, and customer guidance are more complex than ever. Failure to adapt quickly could result in financial loss, legal penalties, or damage to reputation. Even individual buyers are impacted financially, as legal mistakes could result in fines or confiscation of property. Understanding these economic consequences is part of the practical reality of these legal changes. Another consideration is the potential for increased legal challenges. With registration bans and altered definitions of restricted firearms, litigation is likely to rise. Gun owners could find themselves involved in disputes over ownership, compliance, or interpretation of new laws. Courts may struggle with inconsistent state interpretations, leading to prolonged legal battles. For anyone who values their rights, being proactive by understanding the law, keeping records, and seeking professional advice is essential. Legal literacy is no longer optional. It is a survival skill in this rapidly changing landscape. Social dynamics will also shift. Communities that relied on state registration systems for oversight may see increases in untracked firearms. Law enforcement may face challenges in tracing stolen or misused guns. Public safety advocates warn of potential consequences for crime prevention and community security. At the same time, gun rights supporters celebrate newfound freedoms and privacy. This clash of perspectives will shape local, state, and national policy in the coming years. Staying informed allows citizens to navigate these debates intelligently, protect their rights, and make strategic decisions about firearm ownership. Self-defense scenarios are particularly affected. Altered legal interpretations of defensive gun use could change outcomes in court. Individuals defending their property or loved ones may face new standards of proof or judgment. This makes education on the Supreme Court's changes more than theoretical. It is a life-or-death preparation. Whether defending against intruders, navigating confrontations, or traveling with firearms, understanding these nuances is essential to ensure lawful and effective action. Families with children must also consider the new landscape. Firearms in the home require careful storage, documentation, and awareness of legal obligations. Without state registration, personal responsibility is the primary safeguard against accidents, theft, or misuse. Parents, guardians, and household members must take additional steps to ensure that firearms are secured and that everyone in the home understands safety protocols. This is no longer optional. It is a critical part of responsible gun ownership in the post-Supreme Court ruling era. The potential elimination of registration in 12 states also has implications for insurance and liability. Homeowners' insurance policies, firearms liability coverage, and other protections may change if official records no longer exist. Without clear documentation of ownership, claims in the event of theft, loss, or damage may become more complicated. Gun owners should review their insurance policies and consider additional safeguards to protect their investments and families. Private sales, historically regulated by state law, now fall into a gray area. The Supreme Court ruling changes the legal interpretation of transfers, while state registration bans reduce official oversight. This creates both opportunity and risk. Firearms can move more freely, but tracing ownership becomes more difficult. Responsible owners must maintain meticulous records, even if the law does not require it, to protect themselves from legal and financial consequences. Travel, self-defense, family safety, legal compliance, and financial responsibility are all intertwined in this new reality. Understanding the 5 major Supreme Court changes and the potential 12-state registration ban is essential for anyone who owns, buys, sells, or transports firearms. Ignorance is no longer an acceptable strategy. The consequences are too severe, the risks too high, and the legal landscape too complex. Being proactive is the only way to protect your rights, safety, and property.